So we have a playable pure summons build. It's playable. I'm in world tier 4. It's playable. It took a lot to get here. Already, you might see some of the... Good job, Golem. That's perfect. You know what? I'm leaving that in. That is perfect. That is one of my biggest issues still with summons right there. I activated my Blood Golem. He decided to just be here until after the fight was over, and then he ran over here and he used his ability. We have a playable build. Stick with me. Do you remember the Fishymancer from Diablo 2?
I'm not ready.
Have you wanted to play the Fishymancer ever since you started playing Diablo 4? Well, I've got the Fishymancer for you. It is Summons Corpse Explosion, like any good Fishymancer build is. And it's relying on a massive amount of lucky hit chance to actually be able to reduce the cooldown on Army of the Dead, as well as triggering the Ring of Mendeln to be able to actually apply decent damage. And the thing that we just need to test right now is if it can kill a boss and if it can run Nightmare Dungeons. On my Bone Spirit build, I'm currently running tier 35 Nightmare Dungeons on comparable gear. And these builds were really struggling in tier 20. So we're trying to get an idea of whether or not we can get this to run Nightmare Dungeons. If it can run Nightmare Dungeons, I will give it my seal of approval. I won't say it's great. I will say it's doable. I'll say it's even playable. And then I will give you the insight that you need to not waste all of the gold and resources that I did trying to make all of the non-full investment versions of this build work. But that's feedback that I'll send off. Here we go. We got a boss. Get him. Get him. Get him. Get him. Not bad. Not bad. That is not bad at all. Now let's run a Nightmare Dungeon. This is a full investment, full summons build. Every skill point for summons. Kalan's Edict for more attack speed. Army of the Dead on a two-handed weapon. It's about as min-max for summons as we can get, with a very lucky, unique Ancestral Ring of Mendeln as well. Using Lucky Hit here to get that proc up as often as we can. Using Corpse Tendrils for vulnerability. We are fully invested into the Cult Leader Paragon Board. I put every single point that I have into it right now. I've picked up every rare node, every magic node, and the legendary node, and the glyph socket. So that's about as fully invested into it as you can possibly get. In my humble opinion. Our problem is we can't fit Blood Mist onto the build, so there's not a lot that we can do about getting crowd controlled. And again, we can't direct our minions to proactively go anywhere. So they were just sitting on those steps, kind of doing a lot of nothing. Actually need to pick up all this because I spent roughly 5 million gold and all of my resources making 3 separate sets of full gear to be able to test the different setups here. Alright, so we're at max fortify. That's something that you typically can't do. Pretty good. I need to have Decrep up the whole time, but also casting Corpse Explosion the whole time. But also looking for corpses to cast Corpse Tendrils the entire time. It's a very, very involved build for running around with a bunch of summons. Which is not a bad thing. I like that it's involved for sure. Just kind of hard to know what to prioritize. Since our minions can't trigger Lucky Hit, our Corpse Explosion is the only source of triggering Lucky Hit. We need to trigger Lucky Hit to reduce cooldown, but we need to cast Decrepify on everything so that the Lucky Hit from our Corpse Explosion actively reduces things. And what I've noticed is casting curses onto monsters does not force your minions to go attack them. But we really can't fit another skill onto the build, because the Corpse Explosion is too important for the Lucky Hit generation as well as crowd control. Corpse Tendrils is too important for vulnerability. Have to run the 2 summons, obviously. And then Army of the Dead as a finisher for bosses, as well as, you know, difficult or challenging sections like this. But I have to say, minions are not currently dying, which is a marked improvement, and something that we were not able to reproduce without a full investment. One of my biggest wishes for the changes that they made is that you wouldn't have to fully invest into the minions to get them to perform and to stay alive, but they just don't stay up unless you fully invest in them. At least not in World Tier 4. They just still don't. They're dying to AoE at exceptional rates. They were dying to base monsters as I was summoning them, which is, I think, a little bit inexcusable. But here we have a lot of minions here, trying to keep everything decrept so that we're getting the max cooldown reduction, trying to spam Golem. Okay. I mean, you're gonna die in a Nightmare Dungeon every once in a while. There's not a lot that can be done about that. It's hard to play from the back lines because you can't see anything. You have to proactively be the one casting your curses for slow and damage reduction, as well as Corpse Tendrils for vulnerable, as well as Corpse Explosion. There's like a lot of buttons that you're clicking all the time on the build. And since we have fully invested into the Cult Leader Paragon Board, it's very hard for us to actually invest in our own survivability, since we would get a lot of that from the Paragon Board. So I think there's a lot to be said there, just about how those two things kind of play up against one another. Obviously, it'll be less of an issue when you have a fully maxed out Paragon Board where you can build into 4 or 5 boards, realistically. Okay. Whenever you see like big damage numbers come across the board, that is... Alright, we need to blow Army of the Dead there, because we have a very big boy doing AoE damage here.
I have no potions.
Running out of potions. And you need to find the time to fit in. And you need to find the time to fit in actually empowering them with the raised skeletal ability. So many things that take priority. Alright, get my Golem in there. Go in there, Golem. Please. Please.
I have no potions.
Okay. Let's look at how I have it built. It was doing okay. I think it still suffers from a lot of the problems that I've detailed before, but I want to show you what I have so that you can take that, give me your theory crafting, and tell me what you've been doing. I'm going to start with the Paragon boards because this is something that was a big sticking point for people. In my previous review, they said you probably didn't use the Paragon board, you probably didn't use the Paragon boards, so I use the Paragon boards. So let's go ahead and look at that. Paragon boards that I have set up, it's just your base starter board, and then we go straight into, where's the node? Cult Leader. I pick up every rare and magic node in Cult Leader. So that is damage reduction for my minions and intelligence. That is minion damage and intelligence. That is minion damage and attack speed, skeletal mage damage and resistance, minion armor and maximum life, skeletal warrior armor and damage. I pick up the legendary node. I'm currently putting in the Gravekeeper. This is just to get the rare node bonus and also to increase damage with corpses. You can put any of the rare node like scalers into this. This is the one that I currently have at rank 15. I was going to build into the Golem board, but I wanted to pick up every single node that would give as many minion focus bonuses here so that both the skeletons and the Golem would get them, as well as the fact that they buffed Cult Leader, so having all three out should give them 45% multiplicative damage. If you look at the damage numbers while we were sitting there, they're not terrible, but a lot of that is actually being incredibly empowered by the gear that I'm wearing. But first, let's look at the skill tree. In the skill tree, I asked the question, can we actually do a full summons build that looks to maximize the uptime of Army of the Dead? Because arguably the most important or the most powerful bonus that you can give to your minions is a two-handed unyielding commander's aspect. So 164 attack speed and I think the 180 value is broken. I think it's only 90% damage reduction. This is how they stand up even when monsters are incredibly like highly damaging and very tanky. So I asked the question, how can I maximize that? This is nothing. This is just to generate corpses so that we can keep up our corpse explosion stream. Just 1 point into Grim Harvest. This is actually a complete waste of a point. You can take that out, put this anywhere else. 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery. Maxed out Decrepify with maxed Amplify damage. It's going to give us the most slow, the most damage reduction, going to give us lucky hit chance to stun, as well as lucky hit chance to reduce the cooldown on Army of the Dead and on our Golem's Taunt. The Golem Taunt spamming is huge for keeping him up, as well as applying a good amount of damage, especially against bosses. Skeletal Mage Mastery, the 2 points down into Crippling Darkness so that our corpse explosions are applying even more crowd control, maxing out Corpse Tendrils so that we have the lowest cooldown possible on that to pull them all in for slow and stun for greater survivability, as well as vulnerable so our minions do more. That's where we're getting vulnerable here. And then basically maxing out the summon tree here. As you notice, I very rarely want to be right next to my minions because that's where I die. So that's why we're not picking up Hellbent Commander. You can put points into it if you want. I think it's a trap. Inspiring Leader for attack speed for everybody. Death's Defense so that they don't get one shot. Even with this, before the Paragon board, my minions were still dying to base monsters after 2 to 3 hits and a little bit of AoE damage. So you have to max this out. I'm also maxing out Bonded in Essence because they were also not actually staying up when I wasn't using Army of the Dead. So being able to heal them for more, super important. Kalan's Edict, I think this is a complete trap, but I ran it because this is a pure minion build. Army of the Dead, Golem Mastery. Now let's look at the gear, because the gear is not fully optimal, but I went and spent a lot of resources in gold upgrading all of the gear, socketing all of the gear, putting gems into all of the gear, and putting aspects onto all of the gear that would be beneficial for the build. So obviously, big ancestral two-handed sword here with Army of the Dead active on it. Great boots with 4 ranks in Corpse Tendrils and Movement Seeds so that we can actually move around, and then also adding crowd control to targets on Lucky Hit that aren't currently crowd controlled so that we get that more survivability. And for my typical build, I use it for Umbral Essence generation, but here it's just max survivability. When you have at least 7 minions up, they all gain upwards of 20% damage reduction. I only have an 18% roll here, and then also gives me more ranks to Corpse Explosion and damage reduction from distant enemies. Out from below is how I'm making it so that my Corpse Explosions are actually making it to the next fight, hoping to initiate fights with monsters earlier so that I don't have to run to them to get my minions to go attack them. And then also it just gives Corpse skill attack speed, which is huge, and then additional stun and fear so that we can get even more crowd control up, and then additional lucky hit chance to be able to get our Golem cooldown and Army of the Dead cooldown low as fast as possible. 2 maximum Skelly Mages on a decent armor with maximum minion life and summoning skill damage and damage reduction. The helmet is crap. It has ranks to Decrepify, and it has all stats index. This is from a completely different build, but it's good enough. It says ranks to Decrepify, more slow, more damage reduction. We have the skeletons gain additional damage while they're alive on the amulet. Also ultimate skill damage here, damage after killing an elite, crowd control duration, and then curse skills. Ring of Mendeln, I dropped a near perfect ancestral Ring of Mendeln. The lucky hit here, 10% of the time when I'm casting Corpse Explosion, it basically means every time that Corpse Explosion ticks, every single monster has a 4% chance to trigger my minions doing 14,000 explosion damage in an area around them. This is the only reason why they're doing decent amounts of damage, I would say. And that's one of my core issues, is that if I didn't have this, I almost certainly would have walked away from this testing going, they are complete trash, they do nothing, which I think is really, really important, because we trigger this lucky hit really, really often. If you want like a good understanding of like how often we trigger it, Hewed Flesh only has a 12% chance to generate a corpse when it hits a target, and we can perpetually generate corpses even without our Reapers, as long as we drop one onto a pack of at least 2 monsters. So this is up all of the time. And then we have your summoning minions damage. Each time when they deal damage, they gain attack speed up to 30%. This also has, damage to stun monsters, damage to crowd control, and physical damage, which is the damage type that they do. And in addition to that, we're trying to apply crowd control as often as possible. So I think that this is a pretty decently invested in, well-statted build. The only thing I'm really missing here is plus to skeleton warriors. I literally haven't dropped that aspect. Haven't dropped it. Played the game up to level 72, crushing world tier 4 and tier 35 nightmare dungeons on Bone Spirit. Haven't dropped it yet. What can you do? That's RNG. If this isn't enough in a tier 22 dungeon, where again, on my Bone Spirit Necromancer, I'm doing tier 35 dungeons with better survivability with no fortify, then I think we still have some problems with pure summons solo build. Now I want to make a couple statements because people walked away with like some incomplete or incorrect understandings based off of my review video. Summons have already been great utility pieces, using cold mages to generate essence, using reapers to be able to generate corpses, using a golem as a tank on a build until you have enough survivability. They were already good across the board as utility pieces. These buffs have made them slightly better utility pieces. My major issue is that it really hasn't approached the issue of damage output and survivability without heinous amounts of investment. If you notice, almost everything that I have is to fully invest into my summons. And that leaves me with no damage of my own, no utility of my own other than to be a support for my summons, and no survivability. And I think that's really the problem here. They don't draw aggro enough. Only the Bone Golem can taunt. They don't engage monsters who are within close proximity. Casting curses doesn't proc their aggro on targets, even though the monsters are now aggroed on me, and they need some help still. I really wanted these changes to make it so that you didn't have to fully invest in them to get comparable output to other skills that you would put on your skill bar. I don't think that we're there. Now, if you're a full summons build, you can see that you can clear World Tier 4 content. We just did that in Annika's Claim. And that can be good enough. That can be the benchmark. That can be like good enough for most people if we want to relegate a full summons build to a complete casual and non-competitive standpoint, which is perfectly fine. That might be what the devs want to do. I do not personally think that that is adequate for the class fantasy of Necromancer, but it can be fine if that's the statement. But if this amount of investment can't run tier 22 dungeons, I'm not sure what would. I hope that this is an adequate amount of testing for people out there who are looking for an adequate amount of testing. If you want to know the other things that I tested full shadow with support minions. That was still fine. I tested full investment minions with shadow as a secondary damage type. That wasn't good enough without Paragon boards. With Paragon boards, it was okay, but even slower than this because our damage just could not be supplemented by aspects. I also tried just running what I thought was a full damage build and then also including them with minor investment into their survivability, and they just fall down. You need the Paragon board bare minimum for them to stand up, on top of the skill tree, and they don't die as much. But you saw the output of their damage, and I think that that's the best that I can do right now. I would love to hear from you if you found a way to make a pure summons build run competitive level Nightmare Dungeons with a good clear speed with good survivability. I didn't find a way of doing it. I've been testing this now for a couple hours. I've tested these builds for dozens, if not over 100 hours in all the various betas that I've played. And this is after them getting buffed. And I couldn't quite make it there. But I hope that this video was informative. I hope that you enjoyed it or learned something. Thank you so much for watching it. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.